Section 11 of Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, Volume 1, by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, translated by Thomas Carlyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, Chapter 8. Though our friend was weak from loss of blood, and though, ever since the appearance of that helpful angel, his feelings had been soft and mild, yet at last he could not help getting vexed at the harsh and unjust speeches which, as he continued silent, the discontented company went on uttering against him. Feeling himself strong enough to sit up and expostulate on the annoyance they were causing to their friend and leader, he raised his bandaged head, and propping himself with some difficulty, and leaning against the wall, he began to speak as follows. "Considering the pain your losses occasion, I forgive you for assailing me with injuries at a moment when you should condole with me, for opposing and casting me from you the first time I have needed to look to you for help. The services I did you, the complaisance I showed you, I regarded as sufficiently repaid by your thanks, by your friendly conduct. Do not warp my thoughts, do not force my heart to go back and calculate what I have done for you. The calculation would be painful to me. Chance brought me near you, circumstances and a secret inclination kept me with you. I participated in your labours and your pleasures. My slender abilities were ever at your service. If you now blame me with bitterness for the mishap that has befallen us, you do not recollect that the first project of taking this road came to us from stranger people, was weighed by all of you, and sanctioned by every one as well as by me. Had our journey ended happily, each would have taken credit to himself for the happy thought of suggesting this plan and preferring it to others. Each would joyfully have put us in mind of our deliberations and of the vote he gave. But now you make me alone responsible. You force a piece of blame upon me, which I would willingly submit to, if my conscience, with a clear voice, did not pronounce me innocent, nay, if I might not appeal with safety even to yourselves. If you have aught to say against me, bring it forward in order, and I shall defend myself. If you have nothing reasonable to allege, then be silent, and do not torment me now, when I have such pressing need of rest." By way of answer, the girls once more began whimpering and whining, and describing their losses circumstantially. Melina was quite beside himself, for he had suffered more in purse than any of them, more indeed than we can rightly estimate. He stamped like a madman up and down the little room. He knocked his head against the wall. He swore and scolded in the most unseemly manner. And the landlady entering at this very time with news that his wife had been delivered of a dead child, he yielded to the most furious ebullitions, while in accordance with him all howled and shrieked and bellowed and uproared with double vigour. Wilhelm, touched to the heart at the same time with sympathy for their sorrows and with vexation at their mean way of thinking, felt all the vigour of his soul awakened, notwithstanding the weakness of his body. "Deplorable as your case may be," exclaimed he, "I shall almost be compelled to despise you. No misfortune gives us right to load an innocent man with reproaches. If I had share in this false step, am I not suffering my share? I lie wounded here, and if the company has come to loss, I myself have come to most. The wardrobe of which we have been robbed, the decorations that are gone, were mine. For you, Herr Melina, have not yet paid me, and I here fully acquit you of all obligation in that matter." "It is well to give what none of us will ever see again," replied Melina. "Your money was lying in my wife's coffer, and it is your own blame that you have lost it. But if that were all—" And thereupon he began anew to stamp and scold and squeal. Every one recalled to memory the superb clothes from the Count's wardrobe, the buckles, watches, snuff-boxes, hats, for which Melina had so happily transacted with the head valet. Each then thought also of his own, though far inferior, treasures. They looked with spleen at Philina's box, and gave Wilhelm to understand that he had indeed done wisely to connect himself with that fair personage, and to save his own goods also under the shadow of her fortune. "Do you think," he exclaimed at last, "that I shall keep anything apart while you are starving? And is this the first time I have honestly shared with you in a season of need? Open the trunk. All that is mine shall go to supply the common wants." "It is my trunk," observed Philina, "and I will not open it till I please. Your rag or two of clothes which I have saved for you could amount to little, though they were sold to the most conscientious of Jews. Think of yourself, what your cure will cost, what may befall you in a strange country." "You, Philina," answered Wilhelm, "will keep back from me nothing that is mine, and that little will help us out of the first perplexity. but a man possesses many things besides coined money to assist his friends with. All that is in me shall be devoted to these hapless persons, who, doubtless, on returning to their senses, will repent their present conduct. Yes," continued he, "I feel that you have need of help, and what is mine to do I will perform. Give me your confidence again. Compose yourselves for a moment, and accept of what I promise. Who will receive the engagement of me in the name of all?" Here he stretched out his hand and cried, "I promise not to flinch from you, never to forsake you till each shall see his losses doubly and trebly repaired, till the situation you have fallen into, by whose blame soever, shall be totally forgotten by all of you, and changed with a better." He kept his hand still stretched out, but no one would take hold of it. "I promise it again," cried he, sinking back upon his pillow. All continued silent. They felt ashamed, but nothing comforted. And Philina, sitting on her chest, kept cracking nuts, a stock of which she had discovered in her pocket. Chapter 9. The huntsman now came back with several people, and made preparations for carrying away the wounded youth. He had persuaded the parson of the place to receive the young couple into his house. Philina's trunk was taken out. She followed with a natural air of dignity. Mignon ran before, and when the patient reached the parsonage, a wide couch, which had long been standing ready as guest's bed and bed of honour, was assigned him. Here it was first discovered that his wound had opened and bled profusely. A new bandage was required for it. He fell into a feverish state. Philina waited on him faithfully, and when fatigue overpowered her, she was relieved by the harper. Mignon, with the firmest purpose to watch, had fallen asleep in a corner. Next morning Wilhelm, who felt himself in some degree refreshed, learned, by inquiring of the huntsman, that the honourable persons who last night assisted him so nobly had shortly before left their estates, in order to avoid the movements of the contending armies, and remain till the time of peace in some more quiet district. He named the elderly nobleman, as well as his niece, mentioned the place they were first going to, and told how the young lady had charged him to take care of Wilhelm. The entrance of the surgeon interrupted the warm expressions of gratitude our friend was giving vent to. He made a circumstantial description of the wounds, and certified that they would soon heal if the patient took care of them and kept himself at peace. When the huntsman was gone, Philina signified that he had left with her a purse of 20 louis d'or, that he had given the parson a remuneration for their lodging, and left with him money to defray the surgeon's bill when the cure should be completed. She added that she herself passed everywhere for Wilhelm's wife, that she now begged leave to introduce herself once for all to him in this capacity, and would not allow him to look out for any other sick nurse. "Philina," said Wilhelm, "in this disaster that has overtaken us, I am already deeply in your debt, for kindness shown me, and I should not wish to see my obligations increased. I am uneasy so long as you are about me, for I know of nothing by which I can repay your labour. Give me what things of mine you have saved in your trunk. Join the rest of the company. Seek another lodging. Take my thanks and the gold watch as a small acknowledgment. Only leave me. Your presence disturbs me more than you can fancy." She laughed in his face when he had ended. "Thou art a fool," she said. "Thou wilt not gather wisdom. I know better what is good for thee. I will stay. I will not budge from the spot. I have never counted on the gratitude of men, and therefore not on thine. And if I have a touch of kindness for thee, what hast thou to do with it?" She stayed accordingly, and soon wormed herself into favour with the parson and his household. Being always cheerful, having the knack of giving little presents, and of talking to each in his own vein, at the same time always contriving to do exactly what she pleased, Wilhelm's state was not uncomfortable. The surgeon, an ignorant but not unskilful man, let nature have sway, and the patient was soon on the road to recovery. For such a consummation he vehemently longed, being eager to pursue his plans and wishes. Incessantly he kept recalling that event which had made an ineffaceable impression on his heart. He saw the beautiful Amazon again come riding out of the thickets. She approached him, dismounted, went to and fro, and strove to serve him. He saw the garment she was wrapped in fall down from her shoulders. He saw her countenance, her figure, vanish in their radiance. All the dreams of his youth now fastened on this image. Here he conceived he had at length beheld the noble, the heroic Clorinda with his own eyes, and again he bethought him of that royal youth, to whose sick bed the lovely, sympathizing princess came in her modest meekness. "May it not be," said he often to himself in secret, "that in youth as in sleep, the images of coming things hover round us, and mysteriously become visible to our unobstructed eyes? May not the seeds of what is to betide us be already scattered by the hand of fate? May not a foretaste of the fruits we yet hope to gather possibly be given us?" His sick-bed gave him leisure to repeat those scenes in every mood. 1,000 times he called back the tone of that sweet voice. 1,000 times he envied Philina, who had kissed that helpful hand. Often the whole incident appeared before him as a dream, and he would have reckoned it a fiction if the white surtout had not been left behind to convince him that the vision had a real existence. With the greatest care for this piece of apparel, he combined the most ardent wish to wear it. The first time he arose, he put it on, and was kept in fear all day lest it might be hurt by some stain or other injury. Chapter 10. Laertes visited his friend. He had not been present during that lively scene at the inn, being then confined to bed in an upper chamber. For his loss he was already in a great degree consoled. He helped himself with his customary, "What does it signify?" He detailed various laughable particulars about the company, particularly charging Frau Melina with lamenting the loss of her stillborn daughter, solely because she herself could not on that account enjoy the old German satisfaction of having a Mechtilde christened. As for her husband, it now appeared that he had been possessed of abundant cash, and even at first had by no means needed the advances which he had cajoled from Wilhelm. Melina's present plan was to set off by the next post-wagon, and he meant to require of Wilhelm an introductory letter to his friend, manager Servo, in whose company, the present undertaking having gone to wreck, he now wished to establish himself. For some days Mignon had been singularly quiet. When pressed with questions, she at length admitted that her right arm was out of joint. "Thou hast thy own folly to thank for that," observed Philina, and then told how the child had drawn her sword in the battle, and seeing her friend in peril, had struck fiercely at the freebooters, one of whom had at length seized her by the arm, and pitched her to a side. They chid her for not sooner speaking of her ailment, but they easily saw that she was apprehensive of the surgeon, who had hitherto looked on her as a boy. With a view to remove the mischief, she was made to keep her arm in a sling, which arrangement too displeased her. For now she was obliged to surrender most part of her share in the management and nursing of our friend to Philina. That pleasing sinner but showed herself the more active and attentive on this account. One morning, on awakening, Wilhelm found himself strangely near to her. In the movements of sleep, he had hitched himself quite to the back of the spacious bed. Philina was lying across from the front part of it. She seemed to have fallen asleep on the bed while sitting there and reading. A book had dropped from her hand. She had sunk back, and her head was lying near his breast, over which her fair and now loosened hair was spread in streams. The disorder of sleep enlivened her charms more than art or purpose could have done. A childlike smiling rest hovered on her countenance. He looked at her for a time, and seemed to blame himself for the pleasure this gave him. He had viewed her attentively for some moments, when she began to awake. He softly closed his eyes, but could not help glimmering at her through his eyelashes, as she trimmed herself again, and went away to see about breakfast. All the actors had at length successively announced themselves to Wilhelm, asking introductory letters, requiring money for their journey with more or less impatience and ill-breeding, and constantly receiving it, against Philina's will. It was in vain for her to tell our friend that the huntsman had already left a handsome sum with these people, and that accordingly they did but cozen him. To these remonstrances he gave no heed. On the contrary, the two had a sharp quarrel about it, which ended by Wilhelm signifying, once for all, that Philina must now join the rest of the company, and seek her fortune with Serlo. For an instant or two she lost temper, but speedily recovering her composure, she cried, "If I had but my fair-haired boy again, I should not care a fig for any of you." She meant Friedrich, who had vanished from the scene of battle, and never since appeared. Next morning Mignon brought news to the bedside that Philina had gone off by night, leaving all that belonged to Wilhelm very neatly laid out in the next room. He felt her absence. He had lost in her a faithful nurse, a cheerful companion. He was no longer used to be alone. But Mignon soon filled up the blank. Ever since that light-minded beauty had been near the patient with her friendly cares, the little creature had by degrees drawn back, and remained silent and secluded in herself. But the field being clear once more, she again came forth with her attentions and her love, again was eager in serving, and lively in entertaining him. Chapter 11. Wilhelm was rapidly approaching complete recovery. He now hoped to be upon his journey in a few days. He proposed no more to lead an aimless routine of existence. The steps of his career were henceforth to be calculated for an end. In the first place, he purposed to seek out that beneficent lady, and express the gratitude he felt to her. Then to proceed without delay to his friend the manager, that he might do his utmost to assist the luckless company, intending at the same time to visit the commercial friends whom he had letters for, and to transact the business which had been entrusted to him. He was not without hope that fortune, as formerly, would favour him and give him opportunity by some lucky speculation to repair his losses and fill up the vacuity of his coffer. The desire of again beholding his beautiful deliverer augmented every day. To settle his route, he took counsel with the clergyman, a person well skilled in statistics and geography, and possessing a fine collection of charts and books. They too searched for the place which this noble family had chosen as their residence while the war continued. They searched for information respecting the family itself. But their place was to be found in no geography or map, and the heraldic manuals made no mention of their name. Wilhelm grew uneasy, and having mentioned the cause of his anxiety, the harper told him he had reason to believe that the huntsman, from whatever motive, had concealed the real designations. Conceiving himself now to be in the immediate neighbourhood of his lovely benefactress, Wilhelm hoped he might obtain some tidings of her if he sent out the harper. But in this too he was deceived. Diligently as the old man kept inquiring, he could find no trace of her. Of late days a number of quick movements and unforeseen marches had taken place in that quarter. No one had particularly noticed the travelling party, and the ancient messenger, to avoid being taken for a Jewish spy, was obliged to return and appear without any olive leaf before his master and friend. He gave a strict account of his conduct in this commission, striving to keep far from him all suspicions of remissness. He endeavoured by every means to mitigate the trouble of our friend, bethought him of everything that he had learned from the huntsman, and advanced a number of conjectures, out of all which one circumstance at length came to light, whereby Wilhelm could explain some enigmatic words of his vanished benefactress. The freebooters, it appeared, had lain in wait not for the wandering troop, but for that noble company, whom they rightly guessed to be provided with store of gold and valuables, and of whose movements they must have had precise intelligence. Whether the attack should be imputed to some free corps, to marauders, or to robbers, was uncertain. It was clear, however, that by good fortune for the high and rich company, the poor and low had first arrived upon the place, and undergone the fate which was provided for the others. It was to this that the lady's words referred, which Wilhelm yet well recollected. If he might now be happy and contented that a prescient genius had selected him for the sacrifice, which saved a perfect mortal, he was, on the other hand, nigh desperate when he thought that all hope of finding her and seeing her again was, at least for the present, completely gone. What increased this singular emotion still further was the likeness which he thought he had observed between the Countess and the beautiful unknown. They resembled one another as two sisters may, of whom neither can be called the younger or the elder, for they seemed to be twins. The recollection of the amiable Countess was to Wilhelm infinitely sweet. He recalled her image but too willingly into his memory. But anon the figure of the noble Amazon would step between. One vision melted and changed into the other, and the form of neither would abide with him. A new resemblance, the similarity of their handwritings, naturally struck him with still greater wonder. He had a charming song in the Countess's hand laid up in his portfolio, and in the surtout he had found a little note, inquiring with much tender care about the health of an uncle. Wilhelm was convinced that his benefactress must have penned this billet, that it must have been sent from one chamber to another, at some inn during their journey, and put into the coat pocket by the uncle. He held both papers together, and if the regular and graceful letters of the Countess had already pleased him much, he found in the similar but freer lines of the stranger a flowing harmony which could not be described. The note contained nothing, yet the strokes of it seemed to affect him, as the presence of their fancied writer once had done. He fell into a dreamy longing, and well accordant with his feelings was the song which at that instant Mignon and the harper began to sing, with a touching expression, in the form of an irregular duet. 'Tis but who longing knows my grief can measure, alone reft of repose, all joy, all pleasure. I thither look to those soft lines of azure. Ah, far is he who knows me and doth treasure. I faint, my bosom glows 'neath pain's sore pressure. 'Tis but who longing knows my grief can measure. Editor's version. Chapter 12. The soft allurements of his dear presiding angel, far from leading our friend to any one determined path, did but nourish and increase the unrest he had previously experienced. A secret fire was gliding through his veins. Objects distinct and indistinct alternated within his soul, and awoke unspeakable desire. At one time he wished for a horse, at another for wings, and not till it seemed impossible that he could stay did he look round him to discover whither he was wanting to go. The threads of his destiny had become so strangely entangled, he wished to see its curious knots unravelled or cut in two. Often when he heard the tramp of a horse or the rolling of a carriage, he would run to the window and look out in hopes it might be someone seeking him, someone, even though it were by chance, bringing him intelligence and certainty and joy. He told stories to himself, how his friend Werner might visit these parts and come upon him, how perhaps Mariana might appear. The sound of every post's horn threw him into agitation. It would be Melina sending news to him of his adventures. Above all, it would be the huntsman coming back to carry him to the beauty he worshipped. Of all these possibilities, unhappily no one occurred. He was forced at last to return to the company of himself. And in again looking through the past, there was one circumstance which, the more he viewed and weighed it, grew the more offensive and intolerable to him. It was his unprosperous generalship, of which he never thought without vexation. For although on the evening of that luckless day he had produced a pretty fair defence of his conduct when accused by the company, yet he could not hide from himself that he was guilty. On the contrary, in hypochondriac moments, he took the blame of the whole misfortune. Self-love exaggerates our faults as well as our virtues. Wilhelm thought he had awakened confidence in himself, had guided the will of the rest, that, led by inexperience and rashness, they had ventured on, till a danger seized them, for which they were no match. Loud as well as silent reproaches had then assailed him, and if in their sorrowful condition he had promised the company, misguided by him, never to forsake them till their loss had been repaid with usury, this was but another folly for which he had to blame himself, the folly of presuming to take upon his single shoulders a misfortune that was spread over many. One instant he accused himself of uttering this promise, under the excitement and the pressure of the moment. The next he again felt that this generous presentation of his hand, which no one deigned to accept, was but a light formality compared with the vow his heart had taken. He meditated means of being kind and useful to them. He found every cause conspire to quicken his visit to Serlo. Accordingly he packed his things together, and without waiting his complete recovery, without listening to the counsel of the parson or of the surgeon, he hastened, in the strange society of Mignon and the harper, to escape the inactivity in which his fate had once more too long detained him. Chapter 13. Serlo received him with open arms, crying as he met him, "Is it you? Do I see you again? You have scarcely changed at all. Is your love for that noblest of arts still as lively and strong? So glad am I at your arrival that I even feel no longer the mistrust your last letters have excited in me." Wilhelm asked with surprise for a clearer explanation. "You have treated me," said Serlo, "not like an old friend, but as if I were a great lord, to whom with a safe conscience you might recommend useless people. Our destiny depends on the opinion of the public, and I fear Herr Melina and his suite can hardly be received among us." Wilhelm tried to say something in their favour, but Serlo began to draw so merciless a picture of them that our friend was happy when a lady came into the room and put a stop to the discussion. She was introduced to him as Aurelia, the sister of his friend. She received him with extreme kindness, and her conversation was so pleasing that he did not even remark a shade of sorrow visible on her expressive countenance, to which it lent peculiar interest. For the first time during many months, Wilhelm felt once more in his proper element. Of late in talking he had merely found submissive listeners, and even these not always. But now he had the happiness to speak with critics and artists, who not only fully understood him, but repaid his observations by others equally instructive. With wonderful vivacity they travelled through the latest plays, with wonderful correctness judged them. The decisions of the public they could try and estimate. They speedily threw light on each other's thoughts. Loving Shakespeare as our friend did, he failed not to lead round the conversation to the merits of that dramatist. Expressing as he entertained the liveliest hopes of the new epoch which these exquisite productions must form in Germany, he ere long introduced his Hamlet, which play had busied him so much of late. Serlo declared that he would long ago have represented the play, had it at all been possible, and that he himself would willingly engage to act Polonius. He added with a smile, "And Ophelia, too, will certainly turn up if we had but a prince." Wilhelm did not notice that Aurelia seemed a little hurt at her brother's sarcasm. Our friend was in his proper vein, becoming copious and didactic, expounding how he would have Hamlet played. He circumstantially delivered to his hearers the opinions we before saw him busied with, taking all the trouble possible to make his notion of the matter acceptable, sceptical as Serlo showed himself regarding it. "Well then," said the latter finally, "suppose we grant you all this, what will you explain by it?" "Much, everything," said Wilhelm. "Conceive a prince such as I have painted him, and that his father suddenly dies. Ambition and the love of rule are not the passions that inspire him. As a king's son he would have been contented. But now he is first constrained to consider the difference which separates a sovereign from a subject. The crown was not hereditary, yet his father's longer possession of it would have strengthened the pretensions of an only son, and secured his hopes of succession. In place of this, he now beholds himself excluded by his uncle, in spite of specious promises, most probably for ever. He is now poor in goods and favour, and a stranger in the scene which from youth he had looked upon as his inheritance. His temper here assumes its first mournful tinge. He feels that now he is not more, that he is less than a private nobleman. He offers himself as the servant of everyone. He is not courteous and condescending, he is needy and degraded. His past condition he remembers as a vanished dream. It is in vain that his uncle strives to cheer him, to present his situation in another point of view. The feeling of his nothingness will not leave him. The second stroke that came upon him wounded deeper, bowed still more. It was the marriage of his mother. The faithful, tender son had yet a mother when his father passed away. He hoped, in the company of his surviving noble-minded parent, to reverence the heroic form of the departed. But his mother too he loses, and it is something worse than death that robs him of her. The trustful image which a good child loves to form of its parents is gone. With the dead there is no help, on the living no hold. Moreover, she is a woman, and her name is Frailty, like that of all her sex. Now only does he feel completely bowed down, now only orphaned, and no happiness of life can repay what he has lost. Not reflective or sorrowful by nature, reflection and sorrow have become for him a heavy obligation. It is thus that we see him first enter on the scene. I do not think that I have mixed aught foreign with the play, or overcharged a single feature of it. Serlo looked at his sister and said, "Did I give thee a false picture of our friend? He begins well. He has still many things to tell us, many to persuade us of." Wilhelm asseverated loudly that he meant not to persuade, but to convince. He begged for another moment's patience. "Figure to yourselves this youth," cried he, "this son of princes. Conceive him vividly, bring his state before your eyes, and then observe him when he learns that his father's spirit walks. Stand by him in the terrors of the night, when even the venerable ghost appears before him. He is seized with boundless horror. He speaks to the mysterious form. He sees it beckon him. He follows and hears. The fearful accusation of his uncle rings in his ears, the summons to revenge, and the piercing, oft-repeated prayer, 'Remember me!' And when the ghost has vanished, who is it that stands before us? A young hero panting for vengeance? A prince by birth, rejoicing to be called to punish the usurper of his crown? No! Trouble and astonishment take hold of the solitary young man. He grows bitter against smiling villains, swears that he will not forget the spirit, and concludes with the significant ejaculation, 'The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right.'" In these words, I imagine, will be found the key to Hamlet's whole procedure. To me it is clear that Shakespeare meant, in the present case, to represent the effects of a great action laid upon a soul unfit for the performance of it. In this view the whole play seems to me to be composed. There is an oak tree planted in a costly jar. which should have borne only pleasant flowers in its bosom. The roots expand, the jar is shivered. A lovely, pure, noble, and most moral nature, without the strength of nerve which forms a hero, sinks beneath a burden it cannot bear and must not cast away. All duties are holy for him. The present is too hard. Impossibilities have been required of him, not in themselves impossibilities, but such for him. He winds and turns and torments himself. He advances and recoils, is ever put in mind, ever puts himself in mind. At last does all but lose his purpose from his thoughts, yet still without recovering his peace of mind. Chapter 14. Several people entering interrupted the discussion. They were musical dilettanti, who commonly assembled at Serlo's once a week and formed a little concert. Serlo himself loved music much. He used to maintain that a player without taste for it never could attain a distinct conception and feeling of the scenic art. As a man performs, he would observe, with far more ease and dignity when his gestures are accompanied and guided by a tune, so the player ought, in idea as it were, to set to music even his prose parts, that he may not monotonously slight them over in his individual style, but treat them in suitable alternation by time and measure. Aurelia seemed to give but little heed to what was passing. At last she conducted Wilhelm to another room, and going to the window and looking out at the starry sky, she said to him, "You have more to tell us about Hamlet. I will not hurry you. My brother must hear it as well as I. But let me beg to know your thoughts about Ophelia." "Of her there cannot much be said," he answered, "for a few master strokes complete her character. The whole being of Ophelia floats in sweet and ripe sensation. Kindness for the prince to whose hands she may aspire flows so spontaneously, her tender heart obeys its impulses so unresistingly, that both father and brother are afraid. Both give her warning harshly and directly. Decorum, like the thin lawn upon her bosom, cannot hide the soft, still movements of her heart. It, on the contrary, betrays them. Her fancy is smit. Her silent modesty breathes amiable desire. And if the friendly goddess Opportunity should shake the tree, its fruit would fall. And then, said Aurelia, when she beholds herself forsaken, cast away, despised, when all is inverted in the soul of her crazed lover, and the highest changes to the lowest, and instead of the sweet cup of love, he offers her the bitter cup of woe. Her heart breaks, cried Wilhelm. The whole structure of her being is loosened from its joinings. Her father's death strikes fiercely against it, and the fair edifice altogether crumbles into fragments. Our friend had not observed with what expressiveness Aurelia pronounced those words. Looking only at this work of art, at its connection and completeness, he dreamed not that his auditress was feeling quite a different influence, that a deep sorrow of her own was vividly awakened in her breast by these dramatic shadows. Aurelia's head was still resting on her arms, and her eyes, now full of tears, were turned to the sky. At last, no longer able to conceal her secret grief, she seized both hands of her friend, and exclaimed, while he stood surprised before her, "Forgive, forgive a heavy heart. I am girt and pressed together by these people. From my hard-hearted brother I must seek to hide myself. Your presence has untied these bonds. My friend," continued she, "it is but a few minutes since we saw each other first, and already you are going to become my confidant." She could scarcely end the words, and sank upon his shoulder. "Think not worse of me," she said with sobs, "that I disclose myself to you so hastily, that I am so weak before you. Be my friend, remain my friend. I shall deserve it." He spoke to her in his kindest manner, but in vain. Her tears still flowed and choked her words. At this moment Serlo entered, most unwelcomely, and, most unexpectedly, Filina, with her hand in his. "Here is your friend," said he to her. "He will be glad to welcome you." "What!" cried Wilhelm in astonishment. "Are you here?" With a modest, settled mien, she went up to him, bade him welcome, praised Serlo's goodness, who, she said, without merit on her part, but purely in the hope of her improvement, had agreed to admit her into his accomplished troop. She behaved all the while in a friendly manner toward Wilhelm, yet with a dignified distance. But this dissimulation lasted only till the other two were gone. Aurelia having left them, that she might conceal her trouble, and Serlo being called away, Filina first looked very sharply at the doors to see that both were really out, then began skipping to and fro about the room as if she had been mad, at last dropped down upon the floor, like to die of giggling and laughing." She then sprang up, patted and flattered our friend, rejoicing above measure that she had been clever enough to go before and spy the land and get herself nestled in. "Pretty things are going on here," she said, "just of the sort I like. Aurelia has had a hapless love affair with some nobleman who seems to be a very stately person, one whom I myself could like to see some day. He has left her a memorial, or I much mistake. There is a boy running about the house, of 3 years old or so. The papa must be a very pretty fellow. Commonly I cannot suffer children, but this brat quite delights me. I have calculated Aurelia's business. The death of her husband, the new acquaintance, the child's age, all things agree. But now her spark has gone his ways. For a year she has not seen a glimpse of him. She is beside herself and inconsolable on this account. The more fool she. Her brother has a dancing girl in his troupe, with whom he stands on pretty terms, an actress with whom he is intimate, in the town some other women whom he courts. I too am on his list. The more fool he. Of the rest thou shalt hear tomorrow. And now one word about Philina, whom thou knowest. The arch-fool is fallen in love with thee. She swore it was true and prime sport. She earnestly requested Wilhelm to fall in love with Aurelia, for then the chase would be worth beholding. She pursues her faithless swain, thou her, I thee, her brother me. If that will not divert us for a quarter of a year, I engage to die at the first episode which occurs in this 4 times complicated tale. She begged of him not to spoil her trade, and to show her such respect as her external conduct should deserve. Chapter 15. Next morning Wilhelm went to visit Frau Melina, but found her not at home. On inquiring here for the other members of the wandering community, he learned that Philina had invited them to breakfast. Out of curiosity he hastened thither, and found them all in very good spirits and of good comfort. The cunning creature had collected them, was treating them with chocolate, and giving them to understand that some prospect still remained for them, that, by her influence, she hoped to convince the manager how advantageous it would be for him to introduce so many clever hands among his company. They listened to her with attention, swallowed cup after cup of her chocolate, thought the girl was not so bad after all, and went away proposing to themselves to speak whatever good of her they could. "Do you think, then," said our friend who stayed behind, "that Serlo will determine to retain our comrades?" "Not at all," replied Philina, "nor do I care a fig for it. The sooner they are gone, the better. Laertes alone I could wish to keep. The rest we shall by and by pack off." Next she signified to Wilhelm her firm persuasion that he should no longer hide his talent, but under the direction of a Serlo, go upon the boards. She was lavish in her praises of the order, the taste, the spirit which prevailed in this establishment. She spoke so flatteringly to Wilhelm, with such admiration of his gifts, that his heart and his imagination were advancing toward this proposal as fast as his understanding and his reason were retreating from it. He concealed his inclination from himself and from Philina, and passed a restless day, unable to resolve on visiting his trading correspondents, to receive the letters which might there be lying for him. The anxieties of his people during all this time he easily conceived, yet he shrank from the precise account of them, particularly at the present time, as he promised to himself a great and pure enjoyment from the exhibition of a new play that evening. Serlo had refused to let him witness the rehearsal. "You must see us on the best side," he observed, "before we can allow you to look into our cards." The performance, however, where our friend did not fail to be present, yielded him a high satisfaction. It was the first time he had ever seen a theatre in such perfection. The actors were evidently all possessed of excellent gifts, superior capacities, and a high, clear notion of their art. They were not equal, but they mutually restrained and supported one another. Each breathed ardour into those around him. Throughout all their acting they showed themselves decided and correct. You soon felt that Serlo was the soul of the whole. As an individual he appeared to much advantage. A merry humour, a measured vivacity, a settled feeling of propriety, combined with a great gift of imitation, were to be observed in him the moment he appeared upon the stage. The inward contentment of his being seemed to spread itself over all that looked on him, and the intellectual style in which he could so easily and gracefully express the finest shadings of his part excited more delight, as he could conceal the art which, by long-continued practice, he had made his own. Aurelia, his sister, was not inferior. She obtained still greater approbation, for she touched the souls of the audience, which he had it in his power to exhilarate and amuse. After a few days had passed pleasantly enough, Aurelia sent to inquire for our friend. He hastened to her. She was lying on a sofa. She seemed to be suffering from headache. Her whole frame had visibly a feverish movement. Her eye lighted up as she noticed Wilhelm. "Pardon me," she cried, as he entered. "The trust you have inspired me with has made me weak. Till now I have contrived to bear up against my woes in secret. Nay, they gave me strength and consolation. But now, I know not how it is, you have loosened the bands of silence. You will now, even against your will, take part in the battle I am fighting with myself." Wilhelm answered her in kind and obliging terms. He declared that her image and her sorrows had not ceased to hover in his thoughts, that he longed for her confidence and devoted himself to be her friend. While he spoke, his eyes were attracted to the boy, who sat before her on the floor and was busy rattling a multitude of playthings. This child, as Philina had observed, might be about 3 years of age, and Wilhelm now conceived how that giddy creature, seldom elevated in her phraseology, had likened it to the sun. For its cheerful eyes and full countenance were shaded by the finest golden locks, which flowed around in copious curls. Dark, slender, softly bending eyebrows showed themselves upon a brow of dazzling whiteness, and the living tinge of health was glancing on its cheeks. "Sit by me," said Aurelia. "You are looking at the happy child with admiration. In truth, I took it into my arms with joy. I keep it carefully. Yet by it, too, I can measure the extent of my sufferings, for they seldom let me feel the worth of such a gift. Allow me," she continued, "to speak to you about myself and my destiny, for I have it much at heart that you should not misunderstand me. I thought I should have a few calm instants, and accordingly I sent for you. You are now here, and the thread of my narrative is lost." "One more forsaken woman in the world," you will say. You are a man. You are thinking, what a noise she makes, the fool, about a necessary evil, which, certainly as death, awaits a woman when such is the fidelity of men. Oh, my friend, if my fate were common, I would gladly undergo a common evil. But it is so singular. Why cannot I present it to you in a mirror? Why not command someone to tell it you? Oh, had I been seduced, surprised, and afterward forsaken, there would then still be comfort in despair. But I am far more miserable. I have been my own deceiver. I have wittingly betrayed myself. And this is what shall never be forgiven me." "With noble feelings such as yours," said Wilhelm, "you cannot be entirely unhappy." "And do you know to what I am indebted for my feelings?" asked Aurelia. "To the worst education that ever threatened to contaminate a girl, to the vilest examples for misleading the senses and inclinations. My mother dying early, the fairest years of my youth were spent with an aunt, whose principle it was to despise the laws of decency. She resigned herself headlong to every impulse, careless whether the object of it proved her tyrant or her slave, so she might forget herself in wild enjoyment. By children with the pure clear vision of innocence, what ideas of men were necessarily formed in such a scene! How stolid, brutally bold, importunate, unmannerly was every one she allured! How sated, empty, insolent, and insipid, as soon as he had had his wishes gratified! I have seen this woman live for years humbled under the control of the meanest creatures. What incidents she had to undergo! With what affront she contrived to accommodate herself to her destiny! Nay, with how much skill to wear these shameful fetters! It was thus, my friend, that I became acquainted with your sex, and deeply did I hate it, when, as I imagined, I observed that even tolerable men, in their conduct to ours, appeared to renounce every honest feeling of which nature might otherwise have made them capable. Unhappily, moreover, on such occasions a multitude of painful discoveries about my own sex were forced upon me, and in truth I was then wiser as a girl of 16 than I now am, now that I scarcely understand myself. Why are we so wise when young? So wise, and ever growing less so." The boy began to make a noise. Aurelia became impatient and rang. An old woman came to take him out. "Hast thou toothache still?" said Aurelia to the crone, whose face was wrapped in cloth. "Unsufferable," said the other with a muffled voice, then lifted the boy, who seemed to like going with her, and carried him away. Scarcely was he gone when Aurelia began bitterly to weep. "I am good for nothing," cried she, "but lamenting and complaining, and I feel ashamed to lie before you like a miserable worm. My recollection is already fled. I can relate no more." She faltered and was silent. Her friend, unwilling to reply with a commonplace, and unable to reply with anything particularly applicable, pressed her hand and looked at her for some time without speaking. Thus embarrassed, he at length took up a book which he noticed lying on the table before him. It was Shakespeare's works, and open at Hamlet. Serlo, at this moment entering, inquired about his sister, and looking in the book which our friend had hold of, cried, "So you are again at Hamlet? Very good. Many doubts have arisen in me, which seem not a little to impair the canonical aspect of the play as you would have it viewed. The English themselves have admitted that its chief interest concludes with the third act, the last two lagging sorrowly on, and scarcely uniting with the rest, and certainly about the end it seems to stand stock still." "It is very possible," said Wilhelm, "that some individuals of a nation, which has so many masterpieces to feel proud of, may be led by prejudice and narrowness of mind to form false judgments. But this cannot hinder us from looking with our own eyes, and doing justice where we see it due. I am very far from censuring the plan of Hamlet. On the other hand, I believe there never was a grander one invented. Nay, it is not invented, it is real." "How do you demonstrate that?" inquired Serlo. "I will not demonstrate anything," said Wilhelm. "I will merely show you what my own conceptions of it are." Aurelia raised herself from her cushion, leaned upon her hand, and looked at Wilhelm, who, with the firmest assurance that he was in the right, went on as follows. "It pleases us, it flatters us, to see a hero acting on his own strength, loving and hating at the bidding of his heart, undertaking and completing, casting every obstacle aside, and attaining some great end. Poets and historians would willingly persuade us that so proud a lot may fall to man. In Hamlet we are taught another lesson. The hero is without a plan, but the play is full of plan. Here we have no villain punished on some self-conceived and rigidly accomplished scheme of vengeance. A horrid deed is done. It rolls along with all its consequences, dragging with it even the guiltless. The guilty perpetrator would, as it seems, evade the abyss made ready for him. Yet he plunges in, at the very point by which he thinks he shall escape, and happily complete his course. For it is the property of crime to extend its mischief over innocence, as it is of virtue to extend its blessings over many that deserve them not, while frequently the author of the one or of the other is not punished or rewarded at all. Here in this play of ours, how strange! The pit of darkness sends its spirit and demands revenge. In vain. All circumstances tend one way and hurry to revenge. In vain. Neither earthly nor infernal thing may bring about what is reserved for fate alone. The hour of judgment comes. The wicked falls with the good. One race is mowed away, that another may spring up. After a pause in which they looked at one another, Serlo said, "You pay no great compliment to Providence in thus exalting Shakespeare. And besides, it appears to me that for the honour of your poet, as others for the honour of Providence, you ascribe to him an object and a plan such as he himself had never thought of." End of section 11. Section 12 of Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, Volume 1, by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, translated by Thomas Carlyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, Chapter 16. "Let me also put a question," said Aurelia. "I have looked at Ophelia's part again. I am contented with it, and confident that under certain circumstances I could play it. But tell me, should not the poet have furnished the insane maiden with another sort of songs? Could not some fragments out of melancholy ballads be selected for this purpose? Why put double meanings and lascivious insipidities in the mouth of this noble-minded girl?" "Dear friend," said Wilhelm, "even here I cannot yield you one iota. In these singularities, in this apparent impropriety, a deep sense is hid. Do we not understand from the very first what the mind of the good, soft-hearted girl was busied with? Silently she lived within herself, yet she scarce concealed her wishes, her longing. The tones of desire were in secret ringing through her soul. And how often may she have attempted, like an unskilful nurse, to lull her senses to repose with songs which only kept the more awake. But at last, when her self-command is altogether gone, when the secrets of her heart are hovering on her tongue, that tongue betrays her, and in the innocence of insanity she solaces herself, unmindful of king or queen, with the echo of her loose and well-beloved songs. Tomorrow is St. Valentine's Day, and by Gis and by St. Charity. He had not finished speaking when all at once an extraordinary scene took place before him, which he could not in any way explain. Serlo had walked once or twice up and down the room without evincing any special object. On a sudden he stepped forward to Aurelia's dressing table, caught hastily at something that was lying there, and hastened to the door with his booty. No sooner did Aurelia notice this than, springing up, she threw herself in his way, laid hold of him with boundless vehemence, and had dexterity enough to clutch an end of the article he was carrying off. They struggled and wrestled with great obstinacy, twisted and threw each other sharply around. He laughed, she exerted all her strength, and as Wilhelm hastened toward them, to separate and soothe them, Aurelia sprang aside with a naked dagger in her hand, while Serlo cast the scabbard, which had stayed with him, angrily upon the floor. Wilhelm started back astonished, and his dumb wonder seemed to ask the cause why so violent a strife about so strange an implement had taken place between them. "You shall judge betwixt us," said the brother. "What business she with sharp steel? Do but look at it. That dagger is unfit for any actress. Point like a needle's, edge like a razor's. What good's the farce? Passionate as she is, she will one day chance to do herself a mischief. I have a heart's hatred at such singularities. A serious thought of that sort is insane, and so dangerous a plaything is not in taste." "I have it back," exclaimed Aurelia, and held the polished blade aloft. "I will now keep my faithful friend more carefully. Pardon me," she cried, and kissed the steel, "that I have so neglected thee." Serlo was like to grow seriously angry. "Take it as thou wilt, brother," she continued. "How knowest thou but, under this form, a precious talisman may have been given me, so that, in extreme need, I may find help and counsel in it? Must all be hurtful that looks dangerous?" "Such talk without a meaning might drive one mad," said Serlo, and left the room with suppressed indignation. Aurelia put the dagger carefully into its sheath, and placed it in her bosom. "Let us now resume the conversation which our foolish brother has disturbed," said she, as Wilhelm was beginning to put questions on the subject of this quarrel. "I must admit your picture of Ophelia to be just," continued she. "I cannot now misunderstand the object of the poet. I must pity, though, as you paint her, I shall rather pity her than sympathize with her. But allow me here to offer a remark, which in these few days you have frequently suggested to me. I observe with admiration the correct, keen, penetrating glance with which you judge of poetry, especially dramatic poetry. The deepest abysses of invention are not hidden from you, the finest touches of representation cannot escape you. Without ever having viewed the objects in nature, you recognize the truth of their images. There seems, as it were, a presentiment of all the universe to lie in you, which by the harmonious touch of poetry is awakened and unfolded. For in truth," continued she, "from without you receive not much. I have scarcely seen a person that so little knew, so totally misknew the people he lived with, as you do. Allow me to say it, in hearing you expound the mysteries of Shakespeare, one would think you had just descended from a synod of the gods, and had listened there while they were taking counsel how to form men. In seeing you transact with your fellows, I could imagine you to be the first large-born child of the creation, standing agape, and gazing with strange wonderment and edifying good nature at lions and apes and sheep and elephants, and true-heartedly addressing them as your equals, simply because they were there and in motion like yourself." "The feeling of my ignorance in this respect," said Wilhelm, "often gives me pain, and I should thank you, worthy friend, if you would help me to get a little better insight into life. From youth I have been accustomed to direct the eyes of my spirit inwards rather than outwards, and hence it is very natural that, to a certain extent, I should be acquainted with man, while of men I have not the smallest knowledge." "In truth," said Aurelia, "I at first suspected that, in giving such accounts of the people whom you sent to my brother, you meant to make sport of us. When I compared your letters with the merits of these persons, it seemed very strange." Aurelia's remarks, well-founded as they might be, and willing as our friend was to confess himself deficient in this matter, carried with them something painful, nay, offensive to him, so that he grew silent and retired within himself, partly to avoid showing any irritated feeling, partly to search his mind for the truth or error of the charge. "Let not this alarm you," said Aurelia. "The light of the understanding it is always in our power to reach, but this fullness of the heart no one can give us. If you are destined for an artist, you cannot long enough retain the dim-sightedness and innocence of which I speak. It is the beautiful hull upon the young bud. Woe to us if we are forced too soon to burst it. Surely it were well if we never knew what the people are for whom we work and study. Oh, I too was in that happy case when I first betrod the stage, with the loftiest opinion of myself and of my nation. What a people in my fancy were the Germans! What a people might they yet become! I addressed this people, raised above them by a little joinery, separated from them by a row of lamps, whose glancing and vapour threw an indistinctness over everything before me. How welcome was the tumult of applause which sounded to me from the crowd! How gratefully did I accept the present offered me unanimously by so many hands! For a time I rocked myself in these ideas. I affected the multitude, and was again affected by them. With my public I was on the fairest footing. I imagined that I felt a perfect harmony betwixt us, and that on each occasion I beheld before me the best and noblest of the land. Unhappily it was not the actress alone that inspired these friends of the stage with interest. They likewise made pretensions to the young and lively girl. They gave me to understand, in terms distinct enough, that my duty was, not only to excite emotion in them, but to share it with them personally. This, unluckily, was not my business. I wished to elevate their minds, but to what they called their hearts I had not the slightest claim. Yet now men of all ranks, ages, and characters by turns afflicted me with their addresses, and it did seem hard that I could not, like an honest young woman, shut my door and spare myself such a quantity of labour. The men appeared for the most part much the same as I had been accustomed to about my aunt, and here again I should have felt disgusted with them, had not their peculiarities and insipidities amused me. As I was compelled to see them, in the theatre, in open places, in my house, I formed the project of spying out their follies, and my brother helped me with alacrity to execute it. And if you reflect that up from the whisking shopman and the conceited merchant's son, to the polished, calculating man of the world, the bold soldier, and the impetuous prince, all in succession passed in review before me, each in his way endeavouring to found his small romance, you will pardon me if I conceived that I had gained some acquaintance with my nation. The fantastically dizened student, the awkward, humbly proud man of letters, the sleek-fed, gouty canon, the solemn, heedful man of office, the heavy country baron, the smirking, vapid courtier, the young, erring parson, the cool as well as the quick and sharply speculating merchant. All these I have seen in motion, and I swear to you that there were few among them fitted to inspire me even with a sentiment of toleration. On the contrary, I felt it altogether irksome to collect, with tedium and annoyance, the suffrages of fools, to pocket those applauses in detail, which in their accumulated state had so delighted me, which in the gross I had appropriated with such pleasure. If I expected a rational compliment upon my acting, if I hoped that they would praise an author whom I valued, they were sure to make one empty observation on the back of another, and to name some vapid play in which they wished to see me act. If I listened in their company, to hear if some noble, brilliant, witty thought had met with a response among them, and would reappear from some of them in proper season, it was rare that I could catch an echo of it. An error that had happened, a mispronunciation, a provincialism of some actor, such were the weighty points by which they held fast, beyond which they could not pass. I knew not, in the end, to what hand I should turn. Themselves they thought too clever to be entertained, and me they imagined they were well entertaining, if they romped and made noise enough about me. I began very cordially to despise them all. I felt as if the whole nation had, on purpose, deputed these people to debase it in my eyes. They appeared to me so clownish, so ill-bred, so wretchedly instructed, so void of pleasing qualities, so tasteless, I frequently exclaimed, "No German can buckle his shoes till he has learned to do it of some foreign nation." You perceive how blind, how unjust and splenetic I was, and the longer it lasted, my spleen increased. I might have killed myself with these things, but I fell into the contrary extreme. I married, or rather let myself be married. My brother, who had undertaken to conduct the theatre, wished much to have a helper. His choice lighted on a young man who was not offensive to me, who wanted all that my brother had, genius, vivacity, spirit, and impetuosity of mind, but who also in return had all that my brother wanted, love of order, diligence, and precious gifts in housekeeping and the management of money. He became my husband, I know not how. We lived together, I do not well know why. Suffice it to say, our affairs went prosperously forward. We drew a large income. Of this my brother's activity was the cause. We lived with a moderate expenditure, and that was the merit of my husband. I thought no more about world or nation. With the world I had nothing to participate. My idea of the nation had faded away. When I entered on the scene, I did so that I might subsist. I opened my lips because I durst not continue silent, because I had come out to speak. Yet let me do the matter justice. I had altogether given myself up to the disposal of my brother. His objects were applause and money, for between ourselves he has no dislike to hear his own praises, and his outlay is always great. I no longer played according to my own feeling, to my own conviction, but as he directed me, and if I did it to his satisfaction I was content. He steered entirely by the caprices of the public. Money flowed upon us. He could live according to his humour, and so we had good times with him. Thus had I fallen into a dull handicraft routine. I spun out my days without joy or sympathy. My marriage was childless and not of long continuance. My husband grew sick, his strength was visibly decaying. Anxiety for him interrupted my general indifference. It was at this time that I formed an acquaintance which opened a new life for me, a new and quicker one, for it will soon be done. She kept silence for a time, and then continued, All at once my prattling humour falters. I have not the courage to go on. Let me rest a little. You shall not go till you have learned the whole extent of my misfortune. Meanwhile, call in Mignon, and ask her what she wants. The child had more than once been in the room while Aurelia and our friend were talking. As they spoke lower on her entrance, she had glided out again, and was now sitting quietly in the hall and waiting. Being bid return, she brought a book with her, which its form and binding showed to be a small geographical atlas. She had seen some maps for the first time at the parson's house, with great astonishment, had asked him many questions, and informed herself so far as possible about them. Her desire to learn seemed much excited by this new branch of knowledge. She now earnestly requested Wilhelm to purchase her the book, saying she had pawned her large silver buckle with the print-seller for it, and wished to have back the pledge tomorrow morning, as this evening it was late. Her request was granted, and she then began repeating several things she had already learned, at the same time, in her own way, making many very strange inquiries. Here again one might observe that, with a mighty effort, she could comprehend but little and laboriously. So likewise was it with her writing, at which she still kept busied. She yet spoke very broken German. It was only when she opened her mouth to sing, when she touched her cithern, that she seemed to be employing an organ by which, in some degree, the workings of her mind could be disclosed and communicated. Since we are at present on the subject, we may also mention the perplexity which Wilhelm had of late experienced from certain parts of her procedure. When she came or went, wished him good morning or good night, she clasped him so firmly in her arms, and kissed him with such ardour, that often the violence of this expanding nature gave him serious fears. The spasmodic vivacity of her demeanour seemed daily to increase. Her whole being moved in a restless stillness. She would never be without some piece of packthread to twist in her hands, some napkin to tie in knots, some paper or wood to chew. All her sports seemed but the channels which drained off some inward violent commotion. The only thing that seemed to cause her any cheerfulness was being near the boy Felix, with whom she could go on in a very dainty manner. Aurelia, after a little rest, being now ready to explain to her friend a matter which lay very near her heart, grew impatient at the little girl's delay, and signified that she must go, a hint, however, which the latter did not take, and at last, when nothing else would do, they sent her off expressly and against her will. Now or never, said Aurelia, must I tell you the remainder of my story. Were my tenderly beloved and unjust friend but a few miles distant, I would say to you, mount on horseback, seek by some means to get acquainted with him. On returning, you will certainly forgive me and pity me with all your heart. As it is, I can only tell you with words how amiable he was, and how much I loved him. It was at the critical season when care for the illness of my husband had depressed my spirits that I first became acquainted with this stranger. He had just returned from America, where, in company with some Frenchmen, he had served with much distinction under the colours of the United States. He addressed me with an easy dignity, a frank kindliness. He spoke about myself, my state, my acting, like an old acquaintance, so affectionately and distinctly that now for the first time I enjoyed the pleasure of perceiving my existence reflected in the being of another. His judgments were just, though not severe, penetrating, yet not void of love. He showed no harshness. His pleasantry was courteous, with all his humour. He seemed accustomed to success with women. This excited my attention. He was never in the least importunate or flattering. This put me off my guard. In the town he had intercourse with few. He was often on horseback, visiting his many friends in the neighbourhood, and managing the business of his house. On returning he would frequently alight at my apartments. He treated my ever-ailing husband with warm attention. He procured him mitigation of his sickness by a good physician. And taking part in all that interested me, he allowed me to take part in all that interested him. He told me the history of his campaigns. He spoke of his invincible attachment to military life, of his family relations, of his present business. He kept no secret from me. He displayed to me his inmost thoughts, allowed me to behold the most secret corners of his soul. I became acquainted with his passions and his capabilities. It was the first time in my life that I enjoyed a cordial intellectual intercourse with any living creature. I was attracted by him, borne along by him, before I thought about inquiring how it stood with me. Meanwhile I lost my husband, nearly just as I had taken him. The burden of theatrical affairs now fell entirely on me. My brother, not to be surpassed upon the stage, was never good for anything in economical concerns. I took the charge of all, at the same time studying my parts with greater diligence than ever. I again played as of old, nay, with new life, with quite another force. It was by reason of my friend, it was on his account that I did so. Yet my success was not always best when I knew him to be present. Once or twice he listened to me unobserved, and how pleasantly his unexpected applauses surprised me you may conceive. Certainly I am a strange creature. In every part I played it seemed as if I had been speaking it in praise of him. For that was the temper of my heart, the words might be anything they pleased. Did I understand him to be present in the audience, I durst not venture to speak out with all my force, just as I would not press my love or praise on him to his face. Was he absent, I had then free scope. I did my best, with a certain peacefulness, with a contentment not to be described. Applause once more delighted me, and when I charmed the people, I longed to call down among them, "This you owe to him." Yes, my relation to the public, to the nation, had been altered by a wonder. On a sudden they again appeared to me in the most favourable light. I felt astonished at my former blindness. How foolish, said I often to myself, was it to revile a nation, foolish simply because it was a nation. Is it necessary, is it possible that individual men should generally interest us much? Not at all. The only question is, whether in the great mass there exists a sufficient quantity of talent, force, and capability, which lucky circumstances may develop, which men of lofty minds may direct upon a common object. I now rejoiced in discovering so little prominent originality among my countrymen. I rejoiced that they disdained not to accept of guidance from without. I rejoiced that they had found a leader. Lothario, allow me to designate my friend by this, his first name, which I loved. Lothario had always presented the Germans to my mind on the side of valour, and shown me that, when well commanded, there was no braver nation on the face of the earth. And I felt ashamed that I had never thought of this, the first quality of a people. History was known to him. He was in connection and correspondence with the most distinguished persons of the age. Young as he was, his eye was open to the budding youthhood of his country, to the silent labours of active and busy men in so many provinces of art. He afforded me a glimpse of Germany, what it was and what it might be, and I blushed at having formed my judgment of a nation from the motley crowd that squeeze into the wardrobe of a theatre. He made me look upon it as a duty that I, too, in my own department, should be true, spirited, enlivening. I now felt as if inspired every time I stepped upon the boards. Mediocre passages grew golden in my mouth. Had any poet been at hand to support me adequately, I might have produced the most astonishing effects. So lived the young widow for a series of months. He could not do without me, and I felt exceedingly unhappy when he stayed away. He showed me the letters he received from his relations, from his amiable sister. He took an interest in the smallest circumstance that concerned me. More complete, more intimate, no union ever was than ours. The name of love was not mentioned. He went and came and went. And now, my friend, it is high time that you, too, should go. Chapter 17. Wilhelm could put off no longer the visiting of his commercial friends. He proceeded to their place with some anxiety, knowing he should there find letters from his people. He dreaded the reproofs which these would of course contain. It seemed likely also that notice had been given to his trading correspondents concerning the perplexities and fears which his late silence had occasioned. After such a series of nightly adventures, he recoiled from the schoolboy aspect in which he must appear. He proposed within his mind to act with an air of sternness and defiance, and thus hide his embarrassment. To his great wonder and contentment, however, all went off very easily and well. In the vast, stirring, busy counting-room, the men had scarcely time to seek him out his packet. His delay was but alluded to in passing. And on opening the letters of his father and his friend Werner, he found them all of very innocent contents. His father, in hopes of an extensive journal, the keeping of which he had strongly recommended to his son at parting, giving him also a tabulary scheme for that purpose, seemed pretty well pacified about the silence of the first period, complaining only of a certain enigmatical obscurity in the last and only letter despatched, as we have seen, from the castle of the Count. Werner joked in his way, told merry anecdotes, facetious burg news, and requested intelligence of friends and acquaintances whom Wilhelm in the large trading city would now meet with in great numbers. Our friend, extremely pleased at getting off so well, answered without loss of a moment in some very cheerful letters, promising his father a copious journal of his travels, with all the required geographical, statistical, and mercantile remarks. He had seen much on his journey, he said, and hoped to make a tolerably large manuscript out of these materials. He did not observe that he was almost in the same case as he had once experienced before, when he assembled an audience and lit his lamps to represent a play which was not written, still less got by heart. Accordingly, so soon as he commenced the actual work of composition, he became aware that he had much to say about emotions and thoughts, and many experiences of the heart and spirit, but not a word concerning outward objects, on which, as he now discovered, he had not bestowed the least attention. In this embarrassment, the acquisitions of his friend Laertes came very seasonably to his aid. Custom had united these young people, unlike one another as they were, and Laertes, with all his failings and singularities, was actually an interesting man. Endowed with warm and pleasurable senses, he might have reached old age without reflecting for a moment on his situation. But his ill fortune and his sickness had robbed him of the pure feelings of youth, and opened for him instead of it a view into the transitoriness, the discontinuity of man's existence. Hence had arisen a humorous, flighty, rhapsodical way of thinking about all things, or rather of uttering the immediate impressions they produced on him. He did not like to be alone. He strolled about all the coffee-houses and tables d'hôte, and when he did stay at home, books of travels were his favourite, nay, his only kind of reading. Having lately found a large circulating library, he had been enabled to content his taste in this respect to the full, and ere long half the world was figuring in his faithful memory. It was easy for him, therefore, to speak comfort to his friend, when the latter had disclosed his utter lack of matter for the narrative so solemnly promised by him. "Now is the time for a stroke of art," said Laertes, "that shall have no fellow. Has not Germany been travelled over, cruised over, walked, crept, and flown over repeatedly from end to end? And has not every German traveller the royal privilege of drawing from the public a repayment of the great or small expenses he may have incurred while travelling? Give me your route previous to our meeting. The rest I know already. I will find you helps and sources of information. Of miles that were never measured, populations that were never counted, we shall give them plenty. The revenues of provinces we will take from almanacs and tables, which, as all men know, are the most authentic documents. On these we will ground our political discussions. We shall not fail in side glances at the ruling powers. One or two princes we will paint as true fathers of their country, that we may gain more ready credence in our allegations against others. If we do not travel through the residence of any noted man, we shall take care to meet such persons at the inn, and make them utter the most foolish stuff to us. Particularly let us not forget to insert, with all its graces and sentiments, some love story with a pastoral barmaid. I tell you, it shall be a composition which will not only fill father and mother with delight, but which booksellers themselves shall gladly pay you current money for." They went accordingly to work, and both of them found pleasure in their labour. Wilhelm, in the meantime, frequenting the play at night, and conversing with Serlo and Aurelia by day, experienced the greatest satisfaction, and was daily more and more expanding his ideas, which had been too long revolving in the same narrow circle. Chapter 18. It was not without deep interest that he became acquainted with the history of Serlo's career. Piecemeal he learned it, for it was not the fashion of that extraordinary man to be confidential or to speak of anything connectively. He had been, one may say, born and suckled in the theatre. While yet literally an infant, he had been produced upon the stage to move spectators merely by his presence, for authors even then were acquainted with this natural and very guiltless mode of doing so. Thus his first father or mother in favourite pieces procured him approbation before he understood what was meant by that clapping of the hands. In the character of Cupid he more than once descended with terror in his flying gear. As Harlequin he used to issue from the egg, and as a little chimney-sweep to play the sharpest tricks. Unhappily the plaudits of these glancing knights were too bitterly repaid by sufferings in the intervening seasons. His father was persuaded that the minds of children could be kept awake and steadfast by no other means than blows. Hence, in the studying of any part, he used to thrash him at stated periods, not because the boy was awkward, but that he might become more certainly and constantly expert. It was thus that in former times, while putting down a landmark, people were accustomed to bestow a hearty drubbing on the children who had followed them, and these, it was supposed, would recollect the place exactly to the latest day of their lives. Serlo waxed in stature, and showed the finest capabilities of spirit and of body. In particular, an admirable pliancy at once in his thoughts, looks, movements, and gestures. His gift of imitation was beyond belief. When still a boy, he could mimic persons so that you would think you saw them, though in form, age, and disposition they might be entirely unlike him and unlike each other. Nor with all this did he want the knack of suiting himself to his circumstances and picking out his way in life. Accordingly, so soon as he had grown in some degree acquainted with his strength, he very naturally eloped from his father, who, as the boy's understanding and dexterity increased, still thought it needful to forward their perfection by the harshest treatment. Happy was the wild boy, now roaming free about the world, where his feats of waggery never failed to secure him a good reception. His lucky star first led him in the Christmas season to a cloister, where the friar, whose business it had been to arrange processions and to entertain the Christian community by spiritual masquerades, having just died, Serlo was welcomed as a helping angel. On the instant he took up the part of Gabriel in the Annunciation, and did not by any means displease the pretty girl, who, acting the Virgin, very gracefully received his most obliging kiss, with external humility and inward pride. In their mysteries he continued to perform the most important parts, and thought himself no slender personage, when at last, in the character of martyr, he was mocked of the world, and beaten, and fixed upon the cross. Some pagan soldiers had on this occasion played their parts a little too naturally. To be avenged on these heathen in the proper style, he took care at the day of judgment to have them decked out in gaudy clothes as emperors and kings, and at that moment when they, exceedingly contented with their situation, were about to take precedence of the rest in heaven, as they had done on earth, he, on a sudden, rushed upon them in the shape of the devil, and, to the cordial edification of all the beggars and spectators, having thoroughly curried them with his oven fork, he pushed them without mercy back into the chasm, where, in the midst of waving flame, they met with the sorriest welcome. He was acute enough, however, to perceive that these crowned heads might feel offended at such bold procedure, and perhaps forget the reverence due to his privileged office of accuser and turnkey. So in all silence, before the millennium commenced, he withdrew and betook him to a neighbouring town. Here a society of persons denominated Children of Joy received him with open arms. They were a set of clever, strong-headed, lively geniuses, who saw well enough that the sum of our existence, divided by reason, never gives an integer number, but that a surprising fraction is always left behind. At stated times, to get rid of this fraction, which impedes, and, if it is diffused over all the mass of our conduct, endangers us, was the object of the Children of Joy. For 1 day a week each of them in succession was a fool on purpose, and during this he in his turn exhibited to ridicule, in allegorical representations, whatever folly he had noticed in himself, or the rest, throughout the other 6. This practice might be somewhat ruder than that constant training, in the course of which a man of ordinary morals is accustomed to observe, to warn, to punish himself daily. But it was also merrier and surer. For as no child of joy concealed his bosom folly, So he and those about him held it for simply what it was. Whereas, on the other plan, by the help of self-deception, this same bosom folly often gains the head authority within, and binds down reason to a secret servitude, at the very time when reason fondly hopes that she has long since chased it out of doors. The mask of folly circulated around in this society, and each member was allowed, in his particular day, to decorate and characterize it with his own attributes or those of others. At the time of Carnival, they assumed the greatest freedom, vying with the clergy in attempts to instruct and entertain the multitude. Their solemn figurative processions of virtues and vices, arts and sciences, quarters of the world, and seasons of the year, bodied forth a number of conceptions, and gave images of many distant objects to the people, and hence were not without their use, while on the other hand the mummeries of the priesthood tended but to strengthen a tasteless superstition, already strong enough. Here again young Serlo was altogether in his element. Invention in its strictest sense, it is true, he had not. But on the other hand he had the most consummate skill in employing what he found before him, in ordering it and shadowing it forth. His roguish turns, his gift of mimicry, his biting wit, which at least one day weekly he might use with entire freedom, even against his benefactors, made him precious, or rather indispensable, to the whole society. Yet his restless mind soon drove him from this favourable scene to other quarters of his country, where other means of instruction awaited him. He came into the polished but also barren part of Germany, where, in worshipping the good and the beautiful, there is indeed no want of truth, but frequently a grievous want of spirit. His masks would here do nothing for him. He had now to aim at working on the heart and mind. For short periods he attached himself to small or to extensive companies of actors, and marked, on these occasions, what were the distinctive properties both of the pieces and the players. The monotony which then reigned on the German theatre, the mawkish sound and cadence of their Alexandrines, the flat and yet distorted dialogue, the shallowness and commonness of these undisguised preachers of morality, he was not long in comprehending, or in seizing, at the same time, what little there was that moved and pleased. Not only single parts in the current pieces, but the pieces themselves remained easily and wholly in his memory, and along with them the special tone of any player who had represented them with approbation. At length, in the course of his rambles, his money being altogether done, the project struck him of acting entire pieces by himself, especially in villages and noblemen's houses, and thus in all places making sure at least of entertainment and lodging. In any tavern, any room, or any garden, he would accordingly at once set up his theatre. With a roguish seriousness and a show of enthusiasm, he would contrive to gain the imaginations of his audience, to deceive their senses, and before their eyes to make an old press into a tower, or a fan into a dagger. His youthful warmth supplied the place of deep feeling. His vehemence seemed strength, and his flattery tenderness. Such of the spectators as already knew a theatre, he put in mind of all that they had seen and heard. In the rest he awakened a presentiment of something wonderful, and a wish to be more acquainted with it. What produced an effect in one place he did not fail to repeat in others, and his mind overflowed with a wicked pleasure when, by the same means, on the spur of the moment, he could make gulls of all the world. His spirit was lively, brisk, and unimpeded. By frequently repeating parts and pieces, he improved very fast. Ere long he could recite and play with more conformity to the sense than the models whom he had at first imitated. Proceeding thus, he arrived by degrees at playing naturally, though he did not cease to feign. He seemed transported, yet he lay in wait for the effect, and his greatest pride was in moving, by successive touches, the passions of men. The mad trade he drove did itself soon force him to proceed with a certain moderation, and thus, partly by constraint, partly by instinct, he learned the art of which so few players seemed to have a notion, the art of being frugal in the use of voice and gestures. Thus did he contrive to tame and to inspire with interest for him even rude and unfriendly men. Being always contented with food and shelter, thankfully accepting presents of any kind as readily as money, which latter, when he reckoned that he had enough of it, he frequently declined, he became a general favourite, was sent about from one to another with recommendatory letters, and thus he wandered many a day from castle to castle, exciting much festivity, enjoying much, and meeting in his travels with the most agreeable and curious adventures. With such inward coldness of temper, he could not properly be said to love any one. With such clearness of vision he could respect no one. In fact, he never looked beyond the external peculiarities of men, and he merely carried their characters in his mimical collection. Yet withal his selfishness was keenly wounded if he did not please everyone and call forth universal applause. How this might be attained he had studied in the course of time so accurately, and so sharpened his sense of the matter, that not only on the stage but also in common life he no longer could do otherwise than flatter and deceive. And thus did his disposition, his talent, and his way of life work reciprocally on each other, till by this means he had imperceptibly been formed into a perfect actor. Nay, by a mode of action and reaction which is quite natural, though it seems paradoxical, his recitation, declamation, and gesture improved, by critical discernment and practice, to a high degree of truth, ease, and frankness, while in his life and intercourse with men he seemed to grow continually more secret, artful, or even hypocritical and constrained. Of his fortunes and adventures we perhaps shall speak in another place. It is enough to remark at present that in later times, when he had become a man of circumstance, in possession of a distinct reputation, and of a very good, though not entirely secure, employment and rank, he was wont, in conversation, partly in the way of irony, partly of mockery, in a delicate style, to act the sophist, and thus to destroy almost all serious discussion. This kind of speech he seemed peculiarly fond of using toward Wilhelm, particularly when the latter took a fancy, as often happened, for introducing any of his general and theoretical disquisitions. Yet still they liked well to be together. With such different modes of thinking, the conversation could not fail to be lively. Wilhelm always wished to deduce everything from abstract ideas which he had arrived at. He wanted to have art viewed in all its connections as a whole. He wanted to promulgate and fix down universal laws, to settle what was right, beautiful, and good. In short, he treated all things in a serious manner. Serlo, on the other hand, took up the matter very lightly. Never answering directly to any question, he would contrive, by some anecdote or laughable turn, to give the finest and most satisfactory illustrations, and thus to instruct his audience while he made them merry. Chapter 19. While our friend was in this way living very happily, Melina and the rest were in quite a different case. Wilhelm they haunted like evil spirits, and not only by their presence, but frequently by rueful faces and bitter words, they caused him many a sorry moment. Serlo had not admitted them to the most trifling part, far less held out to them any hope of a permanent engagement. And yet he had contrived, by degrees, to get acquainted with the capabilities of every one of them. Whenever any actors were assembled in leisure hours about him, he was wont to make them read, and frequently to read along with them. On such occasions he took plays which were by and by to be acted, which for a long time had remained unacted, and generally by portions. In like manner, after any first representation, he caused such passages to be repeated as he had anything to say upon, by which means he sharpened the discernment of his actors, and strengthened their certainty of hitting the proper point. And as a person of slender but correct understanding may produce more agreeable effect on others than a perplexed and unpurified genius, he would frequently exalt men of mediocre talents, by the clear views which he imperceptibly afforded them, to a wonderful extent of power. Nor was it an unimportant item in his scheme that he likewise had poems read before him in their meetings. For by these he nourished in his people the feeling of that charm which a well-pronounced rhythm is calculated to awaken in the soul. Whereas in other companies those prose compositions were already getting introduced for which any tyro was adequate. On occasions such as these he had contrived to make himself acquainted with the new-come players. He had decided what they were and what they might be, and silently made up his mind to take advantage of their talents in a revolution which was now threatening his own company. For a while he let the matter rest, declined every one of Wilhelm's intercessions for his comrades with a shrug of the shoulders, till at last he saw his time, and altogether unexpectedly made the proposal to our friend that he himself should come upon the stage, that on this condition the others too might be admitted. "These people must not be so useless as you formerly described them," answered Wilhelm, "if they can now be all received at once, and I suppose their talents would remain the same without me as with me." Under seal of secrecy, Serlo hereupon explained his situation, how his first actor was giving hints about a rise of salary at the renewal of their contract, how he himself did not incline conceding this, the rather as the individual in question was no longer in such favour with the public, how if he dismissed him a whole train would follow, whereby it was true his company would lose some good, but likewise some indifferent actors. He then showed Wilhelm what he hoped to gain in him, in Laertes, old Boisterous, and even Frau Melina. Nay, he promised to procure for the silly pedant himself, in the character of Jew, minister, but chiefly of villain, a decided approbation. Wilhelm faltered. The proposal fluttered him. He knew not what to say. That he might say something, he rejoined with a deep-drawn breath. You speak very graciously about the good you find and hope to find in us. But how is it with our weak points, which certainly have not escaped your penetration? These, said Serlo, by diligence, practice, and reflection, we shall soon make strong points. Though you are yet but fresh men and bunglers, there is not one among you that does not warrant expectation more or less. For so far as I can judge, no stick, properly so called, is to be met with in the company, and your stick is the only person that can never be improved, never bent or guided, whether it be self-conceit, stupidity, or hypochondria that renders him unpliant. The manager next stated in a few words the terms he meant to offer, requested Wilhelm to determine soon, and left him in no small perplexity. In the marvellous composition of those travels, which he had at first engaged with, as it were, in jest, and was now carrying on in conjunction with Laertes, his mind had by degrees grown more attentive to the circumstances and the everyday life of the actual world than it was wont. He now first understood the object of his father in so earnestly recommending him to keep a journal. He now for the first time felt how pleasant and how useful it might be to become participator in so many trades and requisitions, and to take a hand in diffusing activity and life into the deepest nooks of the mountains and forests of Europe. The busy trading town in which he was, the unrest of Laertes, who dragged him about to examine everything, afforded him the most impressive image of a mighty centre, from which everything was flowing out, to which everything was coming back. And it was the first time that his spirit, in contemplating this species of activity, had really felt delight. At such a juncture, Serlo's offer had been made him, had again awakened his desires, his tendencies, his faith in a natural talent, and again brought into mind his solemn obligation to his helpless comrades. Here standest thou once more, said he within himself, at the parting of the ways, between the two women who appeared before thee in thy youth. The one no longer looks so pitiful as then, nor does the other look so glorious. To obey the one, or to obey the other, thou art not without a kind of inward calling. Outward reasons are on both sides strong enough, and to decide appears to thee impossible. Thou wishest some preponderancy from without would fix thy choice. And yet, if thou consider well, it is external circumstances only that inspire thee with a wish to trade, to gather, to possess, whilst it is thy inmost want that has created, that has nourished, the desire still further to unfold and perfect what endowments soever for the beautiful and good, be they mental or bodily, may lie within thee. And ought I not to honour fate, which, without furtherance of mine, has led me hither to the goal of all my wishes? Has not all that I, in old times, meditated and forecast, now happened accidentally, and without my cooperation? Singular enough! We seem to be so intimate with nothing as we are with our own wishes and hopes, which have long been kept and cherished in our hearts. Yet when they meet us, when they, as it were, press forward to us, then we know them not, then we recoil from them. All that, since the hapless night which severed me from Mariana, I have but allowed myself to dream, now stands before me, entreating my acceptance. Hither I intended to escape by flight, hither I am softly guided. With Serlo I meant to seek a place. He now seeks me, and offers me conditions which as a beginner I could not have looked for. Was it then mere love to Mariana that bound me to the stage, or love to art that bound me to her? Was that prospect, that outlet, which the theatre presented me, nothing but the project of a restless, disorderly, and disobedient boy, wishing to lead a life which the customs of the civic world would not admit of? Or was all this different, worthier, purer? If so, what moved thee to alter the persuasions of that period? Hast thou not hitherto, even without knowing it, pursued thy plan? Is not the concluding step still further to be justified, now that no side purposes combine with it? Now that in making it thou mayest fulfil a solemn promise, and nobly free thyself from a heavy debt? All that could affect his heart and his imagination was now moving and conflicting in the liveliest strife within him. The thought that he might retain Mignon, that he should not need to put away the harper, was not an inconsiderable item in the balance, which, however, had not ceased to waver to the one and to the other side, when he went, as he was wont, to see his friend Aurelia. Chapter 20. She was lying on the sofa. She seemed quiet. "Do you think you will be fit to act tomorrow?" he inquired. "Oh, yes," cried she with vivacity. "You know there is nothing to prevent me. If I but knew a way," continued she, "to rid myself of those applauses. The people mean it well, but they will kill me. Last night I thought my very heart would break. Once, when I used to please myself, I could endure this gladly. When I had studied long and well prepared myself, it gave me joy to hear the sound. It has succeeded, pealing back to me from every corner. But now I speak not what I like, nor as I like. I am swept along, I get confused, I scarce know what I do. And the impression I make is far deeper. The applause grows louder, and I think, did you but know what charms you, these dark, vague, vehement tones of passion move you, force you to admire, and you feel not that they are the cries of agony wrung from the miserable being whom you praise. I learned my part this morning. Just now I have been repeating it and trying it. I am tired, broken down, and tomorrow I must do the same. Tomorrow evening is the play. Thus do I drag myself to and fro. It is wearisome to rise, and it is wearisome to go to bed. All moves within me in an everlasting circle. Then come their dreary consolations and present themselves before me, and I cast them out and execrate them. I will not surrender to necessity. Why should that be necessary which crushes me to the dust? Might it not be otherwise? I am paying the penalty of being born a German. It is the nature of the Germans that they bear heavily on everything, that everything bears heavily on them. "Oh, my friend," cried Wilhelm, "could you cease to whet the dagger wherewith you are ever wounding me? Does nothing then remain for you? Are your youth, your form, your health, your talents, nothing? Having lost one blessing without blame of yours, must you throw all the others after it? Is that also necessary?" She was silent for a few moments, and then burst forth. "I know well it is a waste of time, nothing but a waste of time, this love. What might not, should not I have done? And now it has all vanished into air. I am a poor, wretched, lovelorn creature. Lovelorn, that is all. Oh, have compassion on me. God knows I am poor and wretched." She sank in thought. Then, after a brief pause, she exclaimed with violence, "You are accustomed to have all things fly into your arms. No, you cannot feel, no man is qualified to feel, the worth of a woman that can reverence herself. By all the holy angels, by all the images of blessedness, which a pure and kindly heart creates, there is not anything more heavenly than the soul of a woman giving herself to the man she loves. We are cold, proud, high, clear-sighted, wise, while we deserve the name of women. And all these qualities we lay down at your feet the instant that we love, that we hope to excite a return of love. Oh, how have I cast away my whole existence wittingly and willingly! But now will I despair, purposely despair. There is no drop of blood within me but shall suffer, no fibre that I will not punish. Smile, I pray you, laugh at this theatrical display of passion." Wilhelm was far enough from any tendency to laugh. This horrible, half-natural, half-factitious condition of his friend afflicted him but too deeply. He sympathized in the tortures of that racking misery. His thoughts were wandering in painful perplexities. His blood was in a feverish tumult. She had risen and was walking up and down the room. "I see before me," she exclaimed, "all manner of reasons why I should not love him. I know he is not worthy of it. I turn my mind aside, this way and that. I seize upon whatever business I can find. At one time I take up a part, though I have not to play it. At another I begin to practice old ones, though I know them through and through. I practice them more diligently, more minutely. I toil and toil at them. My friend, my confidant, what a horrid task is it to tear away one's thoughts from oneself. My reason suffers, my brain is racked and strained. To save myself from madness, I again admit the feeling that I love him. Yes, I love him, cried she with a shower of tears. I love him, I shall die loving him. He took her by the hand and entreated her in the most earnest manner not to waste herself in such self-torments. "Oh, it seems hard," said he, "that not only so much that is impossible should be denied us, but so much also that is possible. It was not your lot to meet with a faithful heart that would have formed your perfect happiness. It was mine to fix the welfare of my life upon a hapless creature, whom, by the weight of my fidelity, I drew to the bottom like a reed, perhaps even broke in pieces." He had told Aurelia of his intercourse with Mariana, and could therefore now refer to it. She looked him intently in the face and asked, "Can you say that you never yet betrayed a woman, that you never tried with thoughtless gallantry, with false asseverations, with cajoling oaths to wheedle favour from her?" "I can," said Wilhelm, "and indeed without much vanity. My life has been so simple and sequestered, I have had but few enticements to attempt such things. And what a warning, my beautiful, my noble friend, is this melancholy state in which I see you. Accept of me a vow which is suited to my heart, which under the emotion you have caused me has settled into words and shape, and will be hallowed by the hour in which I utter it. Each transitory inclination I will study to withstand, and even the most earnest I will keep within my bosom. No woman shall receive an acknowledgment of love from my lips to whom I cannot consecrate my life." She looked at him with a wild indifference, and drew back some steps as he offered her his hand. "'Tis of no moment," cried she, "so many women's tears, more or fewer. The ocean will not swell by reason of them. And yet," continued she, "among thousands, one woman saved. That still is something. Among thousands, one honest man discovered. This is not to be refused. Do you know, then, what you promise?" "I know it," answered Wilhelm with a smile, and holding out his hand. "I accept it then," said she, and made a movement with her right hand, as if meaning to take hold of his. But instantly she darted it into her pocket, pulled out her dagger quick as lightning, and scored with the edge and point of it across his hand. He hastily drew it back, but the blood was already running down. "One must mark you men rather sharply, if one would have you take heed," cried she, with a wild mirth, which soon passed into a quick assiduity. She took her handkerchief and bound his hand with it to staunch the fast-flowing blood. "Forgive a half-crazed being," cried she, "and regret not these few drops of blood. I am appeased. I am again myself. On my knees will I crave your pardon. Leave me the comfort of healing you." She ran to her drawer, brought lint with other apparatus, staunched the blood, and viewed the wound attentively. It went across the palm, close under the thumb, dividing the lifeline and running toward the little finger. She bound it up in silence, with a significant, reflective look. He asked once or twice, "Aurelia, how could you hurt your friend?" "Hush," replied she, laying her finger on her mouth. "Hush." End of section 12. End of Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, Volume 1, by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, translated by Thomas Carlyle.